Buonasera, mi scuso per essere arrivato proprio come ultimo.
Good afternoon. I apologize for being late. I come from Rome. I'm Tobias Spiller, and I work for the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, a German newspaper. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Rachel KRANTON, who's going to talk about a fundamental topic for this conference, whose title is Identity and Global Crisis. And Professor KRANTON works on this topic: how can we reconcile economics with people's identities and different settings? While in the traditional theory, we tend to focus on labor, on money, on machinery, while Professor KRANTON is also studying what we need beyond these raw factors and elements. So it is my pleasure to give her the floor. And then we'll have a Q&A session. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. Very, very pleased to be here. This is working well now. So I'm going to be speaking today. The title is Beyond Money and Markets, Social Identity and the Economy. And the first thing I'd like to say is that this is a report on joint work with George Akerlof, who is there in the front row. This is work that George and I have been doing together for quite some time now. And it's work that we're very excited about. And we're hoping that we are changing and helping to change the way economists think about the patterns, about economic patterns. So you might say to yourselves, identity and economics, what could that possibly be about? So what are all we economists talking about? If you look at the titles of the conference, they might seem a bit unusual. So we have things about personality and European identity. So why are we talking about identity and not only prices, wages, investments, interest rates, regulation, information? The set of typical variables that economists usually discuss. Well, that's because we are working on a new economics. George and I, and collectively, a group of economists, are trying to work on a new economics with a new way of understanding patterns in the economy. So we're going beyond money and beyond markets to see different motivations for people's decisions. So we're looking at how people think about themselves and their goals in life. So we want to understand people as social beings, as they have motivations for themselves and for their families. And we're particularly interested in how social norms and social divisions shape not only individual decisions, but growth and inequality. So we're going to see that people may make decisions based on who they are and who they think they are, but there's also structures within society which in some sense tell people who they are or restrict who people can be. And that has implications for economic growth and particularly for inequality. So again, what we're trying to do is to bring basic insights about people as social beings into economics. So what we have is not identity and economics with a question mark, but identity and economics with an exclamation mark. So we're reporting on what we think is an exciting work where people are social beings and also people who make economic decisions. So let's take a first look at what we're trying to do. So take a look at this phrase. This is a common phrase in English. I don't know if there's an equivalent in Italian. It says, every man has his price. Okay. So what does this mean? What could this possibly mean, this phrase? Well, it indicates that there's some sort of integrity in norms. So a person has some notion of an integrity about how he should behave. But there could be a trade-off. There's a trade-off between who this person is and their ideals and potentially a monetary reward for giving up on those ideals. So here we're beginning to see that there's notions of norms for appropriate behavior, but potentially a trade-off between those kind of norms or motivations for feeling a pride in yourself and monetary, typical economic kinds of incentives. So it's these sorts of trade-offs and interactions that we explore. This is a very basic one, that's why I began with it, but we're going to expand on this theme. Because the prices that we observe, and here I don't want you to only think about prices of apples and oranges, but wages, interest rates, and generally the types of exchanges that people, the types of deals that people make, can depend on social norms and identity, and what is considered to be acceptable and not for different people and different types of people. Okay, so let's get a little bit deeper into what we mean by identity. So what do we mean by identity? This word has many meanings in many, many different contexts. And part of the research that we've been engaged in is to find a notion of identity that's precise enough to be brought into economic analysis. So we've been thinking for quite a long time about a simple meaning that can help us bring identity into economics. So we think of identity as a social designation, like man, woman, black, white, child, adult. And what's important about these designations is they're not just simply a description, but they go along with certain norms for behavior. So let's go back to that phrase I had before, every man has his price. So if you think about it a bit, it says every man has his price. If it said every woman has her price, that would immediately conjure up in your mind a different notion of norms for appropriate and inappropriate behavior and what might be exchanged. So we're immediately seeing that there is something about being a man, which leads to which indicates a certain set of appropriate behavior, and a woman, which leads to certain other kinds of appropriate behavior. And we can then, again, gender or man-women differences are the most obvious ones, but we're going to expand on that quite a bit. So let me just, again, elaborate here. So I think we can all think of a long list of things that men, if we think of men, should and should not do. And I would bet that the list I have for American men might be different than the list you might have for Italian men. Okay? Some of the things on the list might be the same, some of the things on the list might be different, which indicates that this list might be different in different times and in different places. And about the different times, the list that all of us now have in our minds is that list today is different than the list it was 40 years ago. Okay? So these notions of norms and appropriate and inappropriate behavior is something that can differ across time and across place. So these identity and norms derive from and are produced by people in society. And that is itself part of the economic process. It both influences and is influenced by economic exchange. Okay, so to get a better sense of this notion of social designations, norms, and society, what I'd like to do is invite you to take a trip to a place that's very far away from here. It's to the United States Military Academy at West Point, which is on the banks of the Hudson River in New York State. And this is where 17 and 18-year-old men and women are trained to become officers in the United States Army. So this is a military academy. Okay, it's a university. They go when they're 17 and 18. They come out when they're 21 or 22 as officers in the U.S. Army. So let's take a look at their very first day. So their parents drop them off. So the parents bring them up to West Point, and they've got to drop them off and let them go. So let's look at our day. Our day is the name of this very first day. So what is the first day at West Point like? The new cadets, so there's a name for these people, they're called cadets. They arrive, their hair is cut, they put on uniforms, and one of the very first things they have to do is report to senior cadets. And they have to stand, salute, and repeat, right? New cadet Doe, so Doe is just the marker for their name, new cadet KRANTON, reports to the cadet in the red sash for the first time as ordered. And they have to do this until they get it exactly right. Exact words, exact salute. So here are some pictures, of this salute. This is from the Our Day website. So you see here the new cadets, they're the ones who are doing the saluting, and you see the officers in the red sashes. It's around their waists. And here, this is just 3 of many examples, but I did pick out the one in the middle for a particular reason. Okay, take a look at the one in the middle. Do you see something interesting about that picture? Okay. So, okay, you all got it. There's a very tall white man, probably about a half a meter taller than the Asian woman, but he is saluting her. She's the cadet in the red sash. So I'm going to return to that in a second. So what's going on here, and I really want to emphasize, these are nervous. These are 17-year-olds, 18, they've just arrived, they're nervous. And if they don't get it exactly right, they're reprimanded. And their only allowed responses are, yes, sir, no excuse, sir, I don't understand. They're only allowed to say those words. So what is the Army trying to do? What is Our Day all about? Why the dramatic haircut, the new monikers, the scripted speech, the red sash, the ritual? The Army itself, this is not what I'm saying, it's what the Army says about Our Day. It's aiming to change recruits' view of themselves, to transform themselves from civilians to military cadets. So what they're supposed to do is leave the civilian world behind them and the social understandings of the civilian world behind. And they're entering a new social world with its rules and norms. And in that world, a very tall white man must obey the orders of a short Asian woman. And they're all dedicated to the same mission. And that mission is to think of themselves as officers in the United States Army and are dedicated to the values of duty, honor, and country. So again, this is all right from the U.S. Military Academy's website. So Our Day is, as you've probably recognized, an initiation rite. It's the beginning of a 4-year change in identity and norms. And initiation rites and rites of passage are common all over the world. It's not just a military experience. And there are the markers in society of a new person. People go through these rites. They come out as a new person with new responsibilities and expectations. So I've gone to the extreme of the military academy, but we see these kinds of social designations everywhere, not only the distinction between the civilian and the military, or the obvious distinctions of gender, or in the American context, race. We also see these differentiations among students, workers in management, CEOs, and so on, and I'll return to some of these examples later. And indeed, some of these social designations and differences are so much a part of human society that we don't even notice them. We just go around in our daily lives and that's our world, until they're pointed out to us, as perhaps I've been doing. Because once we point them out, it becomes really obvious. So it's evident in the clothes we wear, the way we cut our hair, the styles of speech, the accents, the slang, and the stereotypes we hold. So now you might be wondering, well, but where's all the economics? So the economics is in bringing together prices and decision-making with this view of human behavior. And to do so, we take a typical economic analysis and add 3 ingredients. One is the social designations and the categories and people's assignment to these categories. 2, it would be the norms for behavior which correspond to these designations. And 3 would be the losses or gains in pride, sense of self, not only to myself but to others if the norms are not followed. And I should emphasize that these ingredients that we use in our studies come not from our imagination, but they come from researchers who are very skilled at observing social settings. For example, the person who spent 4 years at West Point and followed these recruits through their academic program. So these are anthropologists, historians, sociologists, political scientists, and so on. So once we add these ingredients, we can see that identity immediately affects economic decisions. So for example, if I think of myself as a woman, I may act in ways appropriate to being a woman, even when those actions reduce my income. So here again is one of these trade-offs. Furthermore, I may be offended by others' actions, so other women or other men who violate norms for behavior. I may get very upset if somebody's not acting the way they should. And in that case, I may not want to be with that person. I might distance myself from that person or otherwise act against them, even when those actions are also reducing my income. So these are just, again, an outline of the ways we see these trade-offs between the social norms and the sense of self or pride and income and typical economic decisions. Okay. So again, what are the three ingredients? Social designations, norms for behavior corresponding to designations, and the losses in pride to self and others if the norms are not followed. Now, we can think about this type of analysis in two ways. We can think about it first, what we call the short run. In the short run, none of these three ingredients change. So I'm just interacting in my world. My designation is given to me. So I am who I am. Okay? The norms are fixed. Okay? So the appropriate and inappropriate behavior for people within society are fixed. And the social designations and the categories are also fixed. So we have certain notions of who people are in society. However, in the long run, okay, that's the phrase we use for thinking about as time passes, it is also true that people can change the social designation and norms. People may choose who they want to be. So what is an example of that? I may decide to emigrate. Okay? I may decide to pursue a different kind of education. Okay? I may choose, and here choosing for somebody else, I may choose a school for my children, a particular way of bringing up my children. So there are choices that can be made about who people are. It is also possible that the norms themselves change. So they may change. There are people out there, and again, I'm sure you're going to start thinking about examples of this, who might want to change norms for profit. If you can induce people to think that it's appropriate to do certain things, and including buying your product, then there will be people who will have an incentive to change the norms, and also certainly for political advantage, again, in a study of politics. And we've also seen that there are changes in social designations and the categories themselves. So we have evolving notions of, for example, citizenship in Europe. So we've had talks about, is there a European identity? That's a whole new designation and a whole new category. These can come about by people who are acting in a very conscious way. It can also be part of social revolutions to change the way people think. So if we think about the great revolutions in society, so to speak of the French Revolution, right? People became citizens. So there can be great social transformations that change the social designations and the categories themselves. So I want to argue that since identity is fundamental behavior in the long run, the choice of identity may in the end be the most important economic decision people make. Since who you are is going to affect every decision you make, then that primary decision or that primary choice that's been made for you might be the most important decision to make. But it is incredibly important to remember that this choice can be severely limited. There are structures in society which will limit people's choice. So these designations and these categories that I'm describing are associated with particular characteristics. So say particular skin color, particular family background, particularly hair color. So for example, in the United States at least, when you think, if I were to ask you, and probably here in Italy as well, if I were to ask you to imagine the boss of a firm, what are you going to start to picture? You know, picture somebody from a particular social background. Okay, so somebody who might look like that. Okay, so you get the point. It's an older person, a man, white. Okay, so the image you're going to come up with, at least traditionally, of course these things are changing, might be this image. And so if you're trying to achieve to be a manager and you don't look like this, this might not be something that you could ultimately achieve. So in the military, traditionally, officers, so the people who went to West Point were literally gentlemen, okay, in that classic sense, which of course relates to ethnicity. And so it's quite interesting that there's an artifact of this. This was until the 1950s, where the U.S. Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 133, was concerning somebody, an officer, who was not acting as he should. And the literal phrasing was conduct unbecoming an officer and gentleman. So there's an historical artifact of the social structures or the social classes which were leading to officers. Of course, the United States military is very different today, but again, that's part of the story here, is that these things can change, and why do they change? Now, this might be tough to see, but I thought this is a book about the British Imperial Empire and where they recruited their officers. You can see they're the Scots, and there's particular groups in India as well. So again, just to say that there's these notions that particular people, particular designations look like somebody, they come from a particular background. So birthplace, accent, skin color, low wealth can all limit choice. So therefore, the constraints on identity choice can be one of the most important determinant of a person's economic well-being. And similarly, societal changes in these designation and norms can fundamentally alter the distribution of income and wealth. Okay. So the basic message here is if you take regular economics and you add identity to it, you're going to get some new insights. So what I'd like to do here is go through 3 examples. The first example is an example of smoking. The second example is an example of wages and employment. And the third example is education and schooling. And I should emphasize these are microeconomic examples, so I'm literally going to talk about an individual making a decision. And we're going to see the interplay of prices and identity and how identity matters. And we're going to see how changes in social designations and norms make a difference in economic outcomes, well-being, and equality. Now, the examples I'm going to present are from the United States. Of course, I'm an American. That's the context I know best. But the analysis, I should emphasize, is applicable anywhere. The identity ingredients, those 3 ingredients I mentioned, they're from observation of a particular setting. So in any particular social setting, we're going to say, look for those 3 ingredients, and you'll be able to construct an analysis of identity and economics in that setting. Okay, so let's turn to smoking. Obviously, to say smoking is a major medical and economic issue. The Center for Disease Control in the United States, so this is statistics from the United States, lists smoking as the #1 preventable cause of death in the United States. In pure numbers in terms of work productivity, let alone medical costs, this is just work productivity, there's a loss in productivity of about $82 billion a year. And not surprisingly, it's been the subject of much study within economics, and there's been a lot of policy to reduce smoking. So let's take a look at smoking through the lens of economics and identity. So we would begin with a typical economic study, where we start out with, well, there are just some people out there who like to smoke. They like the taste of tobacco. And we can add to that nicotine is an addictive product. Okay? And then a person would decide how much to smoke, given the price of cigarettes, their own income, and perhaps weighing the health costs, the future health costs. And so you come out with an answer of smoking rates. So this kind of analysis would tell us that smoking rates would depend on individual tastes, prices, income, and understanding of health costs. There should be no particular difference between smoking rates of men and women, who are the same with respect to all of these things, or between blacks and whites, and so on. There should be no difference at all. But of course, historically, we know this is not the case. This is not what's happened historically. So historically in the United States, men smoked much more than women. So when I mean historically, going back to the to the 1900s. Gradually over the 1900s, the rates got closer until the 1970s, when the smoking rates of men and women largely equalized. And there's very little evidence to support an explanation based on the convergence of income and the understanding of health issues. So the typical economic model would tell you, well, women and men now have about the same amount of money, or they both have the same understanding of health issues. But there's very little evidence of that. So let's do some observation. Let's take a look out there and see, what were people saying about smoking? What was the image of smoking? Let's look at the social norms. Smoking was historically only acceptable for men until the 1960s and 70s. So this is an ad campaign, a very famous ad campaign. So you've come a long way, baby. And what we see, of course, in the background is a frumpy woman, scrubbing the clothes, and she's stuck in her house, and that's all she does. She's a housewife. In the foreground is the modern, hip, liberated woman. And what this ad, of course, is telling you is that the women's rights movement has not only freed you from laundry, it's giving you the right to smoke, and you should enjoy smoking. So I should say this is just an example. There's many people who've studied the change in the norms at this time. So now let's do something very simple from our observation. Let's add our 3 ingredients to our analysis. Let's have the social designations of men and women, the norms pre and post 1970, say, and the losses from violating the norms pre-1970, and easily, with no fuss at all, we get the prediction that smoking rates converge. And again, I'm not going to say there's anything fancy and any mathematical derivation here. It's just we said, let's go look. Let's go take a look about what people were saying and what people's attitudes were. And quite frankly, it's such a remarkable difference, we can't ignore it. And so here we see quite very clearly the implications for the changes in the norms. And we also see very clearly the implications of manipulation of the norms for advantage. So someone was trying to sell cigarettes. And if you take a look at the internal documents, so this is all available online. It's quite remarkable to read them. If you look at some internal documents from the marketing divisions of Philip Morris and so on, you see that the companies wanted to create an image to go with women's new sense of self in this new age. So this is all, it's not any accident. This was a purposeful selling of this image to correspond with the new image that women were creating for themselves. So now let's move to the second example. Organizations, work incentives, and identity. So economists have studied and are very concerned with how to best give correct incentive to workers to compensate workers for how well and how hard they work. Now, like I said, we studied this question at length, but there's a big problem. In most modern enterprises, it's very hard to see work effort. So we're not in a factory now where you can see somebody doing something piece by piece by piece. It may be somebody who's doing something creative or somebody who's selling. So it's actually difficult to see how hard somebody is actually working. So economists have said, well, yes, it's very hard to see work effort, but perhaps we can devise wages and incentives that are based on what we can see, like, for example, a stock price, rather than how hard people work. Because we can't see how hard people work, but perhaps there's a relationship between how hard people work and the stock price. So we might see bonuses being paid according to this figure, which is observed. And this is particularly important in jobs where effort is hard to observe. But now let's go back to West Point. I'm not sure I could imagine a place where it's harder to observe effort than on the battlefield. Now, the West Point does not pay bonuses. The U.S. Army does not pay bonuses. The whole West Point program and the whole Army program challenges the theories of work and incentives based on wages and bonuses. Instead, we might think that how people feel about themselves and their part in an organization may be what's critical to work incentives. And we may be particularly attentive to this because we actually know that there are lots of problems that arise when workers are working for bonuses. Workers may do things to increase their bonuses and not necessarily do what is good for the company or good for the clients, because these are all much harder to see. Okay? So which is to say that the schemes which we come up with because work effort is harder to observe, could actually create quite bad incentives for workers to do things which actually harm clients, for example. Okay. But if workers can be induced to identify with their firm, we could have a very different outcome. And again, this might be especially important when effort is hard to observe, like in the military in battle. So again, based on observation, we study work incentives with identity as a possibility. So let's think of a very simple way of doing this. We have social designations of workers as insiders or outsiders to the firm. We have norms where insiders should work in the firm's best interests. And we want to posit that there are gains, that insiders are proud when they work for the good of the firm. And if we were to include this in a model, this very simple theory gives a different view of incentive pay and human resource policies. Okay, so let's take a simple question. Should a firm hire a supervisor to better observe workers? Okay, so do you want to have somebody who watches the workers more attentively to see if they can observe better this work effort? Well, in a strict supervision regime, a supervisor would report on workers. Management could then fine-tune incentives. You might be able to pay the workers for their effort. But I'm sure you can imagine that closely monitored workers feel less a part of the organization. They start to feel like they're just, they're being watched all of the time and nobody trusts them. And so they start to feel like they're outsiders, and as outsiders, you better pay them a lot if they're going to work hard. Take the opposite kind of supervisory policy, which we say loose supervision, where the supervisor every now and again lets some things go. So again, this is an American context I'm talking about. The management may be able to less fine-tune incentive pay. So, sometimes workers don't work so hard, but the workers and the supervisor could develop what we might think of as an insider work group identity with norms more aligned with the organization's interest. And what's actually interesting is that when you look at military units, you actually see some of this. So the sergeants aren't always reporting on their men or women to the higher authorities, right? And so the good sergeants, the people that the men are really willing to fight for, right, are the ones who understand the circumstances where, well, I'll just let that one go. Okay, so you have actually look inside military units, you see these things. So the model predicts, for example, that organizations where workers feel more like insiders will have less bonus pay. They're just going to earn a straightforward wage. And these organizations will have a greater incentive to invest in worker identification when effort is harder to observe. And again, we can go to the extreme example of a military versus civilian comparison to see this play out. Military pay is relatively flat, meaning that the higher ranks don't earn much more than the people in the lower ranks. And it's also overall lower than for comparable positions in civilian firms. And as we saw, the military makes this huge investment in worker identification. Now again, this is an extreme version. We pick the military, of course, to show the contrast. But that's not to say these same things may be playing out within regular old enterprises. And this notion of identity has implications for fiduciary responsibilities on the parts of workers and management. And I would say that this is particularly important today for the reform of financial institutions, when people should be thinking about themselves as a part of the firm that they're working for, and not just trying to, what we would say, game the firm to their own advantage. Okay, let me move to my third example. The third example is education, and we're going to look at schools and children's identity, or adolescents' identity. So education is a primary driver of individual income and economic growth. And there's so much work on this, I don't have to give you all the statistics. I can just tell you the special name that we have for education. It's called human capital. There's a notion that we as human beings, educated human beings, are as important to an economy as roads, bridges, and factories. So we have human capital. So development of human capital is critical for the growth of an economy, and it's also critical for an individual's own well-being or economic well-being. So if we were to just think about a young person and their decisions whether or not to get an education, so we just take a look at the wages, and we were just to do a kind of standard economic study of this, we would say that students, let's say teenagers, should stay in school as long as the future gains are higher than the current costs. So future gains are, how much more money would I earn if I were to stay and go to college, versus then the current costs, meaning it's hard to work in school or perhaps getting a job today. But in the United States, at least, it's quite clear that a lot of decisions are not based on this kind of calculus. We actually see extraordinarily high dropout rates in the United States, particularly among, in particular groups within the society, so African Americans and Hispanics. Now, this could be due to the schools that these teenagers are attending are pretty lousy because there's insufficient school budgets. So there's actually maybe not a return to staying in school. It could also be that there's incorrect beliefs about future wages. So people may not understand that if they stayed in school for longer that they would earn more. And I certainly want to say this can be part of the puzzle. But I think we should also do a bit of observation. Let's go inside those high schools. Let's go inside the schools and see what is actually happening in those schools. How are these kids making their decisions? So it could also be very much due to how students think about themselves, and particularly how the schools treat the students. So it goes both ways. Are the schools fostering a setting where students identify with learning, where they start to think of themselves as being part of the school and wanting to learn? So again, let's now look at education, or the acquisition of human capital, through the lens of economics and identity. What actually is going on inside schools? So I'm going to describe for you what's a pretty typical American high school. Students form social groups. And these groups are associated with people who are more or less engaged in school and learning. So here are some of the names that you'll hear. So there are the jocks. So jocks are people who are into athletics. I'll get to that in a second. They're the ones who are kind of the popular kids in school. And they do pretty well in their classes, but not excessively well. Then there are the nerds. I don't know if that word is, yeah, okay. So then there are the nerds who are, they study all the time. And geeks might be a similar kind of word. Burnouts are those who really don't want to have anything to do with the school. They hang around, they cut class, what we would say cut class. They're not involved in school activities. And to give you to the sense to which this is ubiquitous, I'm going to show you some pictures, okay? So the one on the right, it might be hard to see this, but I find these pictures to be so telling. These are titles of books that kids read. So the one all the way over there on the left the title is The Beauty Queen and the School Nerd. Okay, can you guess which one the beauty queen is and which one the school nerd is? Right, okay, you can, okay. So nerds always are wearing glasses. They're usually not blonde, because she's got the book. And this is of an unlikely friendship. Okay, so that's a point about this book. Unlikely friendship between the beauty queen and the school nerd. The middle one is, I think, I'm sure I have to go more than to say the revenge of the nerd, right? The idea is that nerds eventually grow up and, they're the ones who make the money. Of course, this poor sad kid is also wearing glasses and has lots of books. The Dumb Jock is an interesting book. So jocks, people involved in athletics, are usually considered to be not so smart, but they want to play their sport, right? So they sometimes need help. So this is about a relationship between a dumb jock and a smart kid who then helps the dumb jock get through school. And there's an interesting twist, is that the jock and the nerd actually turn out to have a bit of a relationship, which of course shatters all sorts of norms. Okay, so that's what this book is about. Now, I mean, I'm showing you these things to indicate to you that we can just look at this and figure it out and see that these things are salient in the lives of teenagers, to the extent to which that these pictures, we can just look at them and immediately know the messages they're telling us. Okay. So if we were to put these kinds of categories, we need our three ingredients again. See where I am? Okay. We need these three ingredients. The three ingredients would be the social designation, so jocks, nerds, burnouts. We need the norms for behavior, and we need the gains and losses in utility or in pride that would go along with violating the norms for behavior. And, oops, here we go. Sorry. I forgot to advance my slides. Okay, where am I? I was doing so well. There we go. All right. So here are our ingredients: the social designations, the norms for insiders who identify with school and schooling, and then the gains and losses. So the insiders, they feel proud when they fulfill the school goals. So they might be on the chess team. That would be the nerdy kind of insiders, or they might be on the football team. Those are the kind of jock kind of insiders. And then there are the outsiders who just, fool around in class and try and disrupt the school altogether. And we're going to see from such an analysis that the insiders may actually overachieve and the outsiders underachieve. And what's interesting, if you look at the schools, some schools administrators in some sense get this, and also we increasingly see parents and groups of parents trying to address this. So let's take a look at school policies. There's this actually if you think about it, again, this is one of these things that's so common in the United States that you might not think about it, but once you think about it, you start to say, what are all these athletic programs doing in high schools? Why do high schools have football teams? Why do they have soccer teams increasingly and lacrosse teams and so on? And I'm not sure this is the reason why, but it certainly has an implication for children's attachment to schools. If you are an outsider, but you want to play football, then you become an insider by participating in the sports. So there's some very interesting studies, for example, in Texas, of Hispanic kids who join the football team. Right? So they're the poor kids in town. They're very much the outsiders, very much discriminated against. But now the football team is open to them. And they start to become more integrated into the school system. The other thing that you see is that you start to see groups of parents and even schools themselves adjusting the curriculum to the student population. So you see huge debates within the United States about curricula. What kind of history should we be teaching? What kind of literature should we be teaching? Because teaching Moby Dick, which is quite a different book than teaching an African-American classic. And we also see increasingly new types of schools emerging. So let me just give you again some visuals to bring this home. Again, I just took this off of the websites. So I think that, again, the one on the left is really interesting. What is this a picture of? This is a picture of the high school football champions in New Jersey. So this is the state championship football team. And it's a team from Newark, New Jersey. So Newark, New Jersey is a quite poor city, obviously overwhelmingly African American. Now these are a bunch of proud young men, and to be a part of this football team and this winning football team, they had to stay in school. Okay, so this is a way you can see how this athletic program might be able to bring people into the educational system that might not otherwise be. The picture down on the right is from the South. It might be hard to see, but it's a pretty integrated team. Okay. And here's the phenomenon I wanted to tell you about. This was back on this bullet point. There's new types of schools which are emerging because increasingly, I think, parents and different groups within the society recognize that, or at least believe that, if the school is more attentive to the child's social social designation in our terms, of the student's identity, then the child may learn better. So the top picture is from, these are what are called, the top picture is from what's called a charter school. A charter school is schools that receive funding from the government, but they have an independent curriculum. So the top picture is from the Booker T. Washington Public Charter School for Technical Arts. This is a high school in Washington, D.C. And who is Booker T. Washington? Booker T. Washington is a famous black scientist from the early 1900s. So of course you see what they're doing here is they're creating a school that's saying this is a school where we as African Americans can achieve. The middle pictures there are from websites for homeschoolers. So homeschooling might be a phenomenon you're not so familiar with, but it's growing in the United States, is where parents teach their children at home. Okay? Now, there's a couple of reasons. One is that parents may believe that their children will learn more at home. Okay? They also, literally, that the schools may be bad and their children are learning more at home, or their child may have a learning disability. But as you can very much see from these titles here, that a large part of homeschooling has to do with making the school meet the child's identity, and also the parents here again choice of identity for their children. So it's a very big movement among strong Christian communities, we might say fundamentalist Christian communities in the United States. And the bottom one is again a charter school, and this is a charter school from Washington, D.C., but here we see a kind of incredible mix of things. We can see how specialized this can get. This is the Latin American Montessori bilingual public charter school. So I know you all know what Montessori is. So, and then the Latin American bilingual, I'm sure you can figure out as well. So this is for Hispanic kids. They want them to grow up speaking Spanish and English, but these are a group of parents who believe in the Montessori system of education. So we're increasingly seeing this diversity of education, of educational options. And to a large extent, we can see that this may be a response to schools which aren't necessarily creating the atmosphere that at least parents feel their children should have to enhance their learning. And that's both the literal skills of reading and writing and arithmetic, but also feeling a part of the school community. So now I'll conclude. So this research brings identity and norms into economic analysis, and again, we need our three ingredients: the social divisions, the social designations, the norms associated with those designations, and the gains and losses that people may feel when they follow those norms or not. And critically, these ingredients come from observation. Okay? They come from observation of the social context. So every single example I've given you is from a real world, it's a real place in real time. Now, of course, these were United States examples, but this method is applicable anywhere. And people will make decisions rationally. They're facing trade-offs, but their payoffs, what they're trading off here, depends on their identity, their social network, and their social relations. And so this combination of economics and identity can lead us to new and different conclusions. So we've seen, for example, a new view of supervisory policy in school and the importance of institutional identities in the schooling example. So economics as more than money and more than market can lead us to see how changes in norms, social divisions impact individuals. It can give us guidance for improving institutional performance, and it can also advance our understanding of inequality and equality. Thanks very much.
Grazie, Professor Cranton.
Thank you, Professor Cranton. Thank you, Professor Cranton. We're seeing that in economics there's much more than output formulas or the interpretation of companies' turnovers. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but And he's looking at me as if I am trying to make a suicidal attempt. However, you're not being paid for every piece you produce. You have mentioned bonuses or incentives, but as a German, I can tell you a long story. In Eastern Germany, it was important to reach the plan objectives, and then you know what happened in that economy, and you know what has happened to the financial sector. Professor KRANTON has clearly explained to us that there are many other things beyond bonuses and incentives. There are more important issues such as identity, feeling of belonging within a company, and this model has to do with the people's identity, and this model, I'm sure, is valid in Italy too. And Professor KRANTON has made some examples, American examples, of course. In different settings. In your curriculum, I read that you have been teaching for some years, but before you worked for the World Bank and in Egypt for development projects. And I think it would be interesting to have a brainstorming all together to understand how we can implement this model to the Italian setting or situation. And I could mention some ideas. You know, in Italy there's a major discussion on civil servants who don't work enough. They're called loafers. Or there are other people who want to work. They're ambitious, but they are not supported by their colleagues. And we could discuss this. And then as to companies, there are family-run companies where there's a strong identification with the company. Very often there are less than 15 employees, so there's a close contact with the owner and the boss. Then there are larger companies when there are many workers and trade unions as well. So the situation is different. I'm really interested in the concept of Italian entrepreneur. I wanted to compare Germany with 80 million inhabitants to Italy, and in Germany there are about 3 million people with a VAT number. In Italy, 60 million inhabitants and 5.6 VAT holders. VAT number holders. It's a whole population, a subgroup in the of the population. So in Italy, independent workers, self-entrepreneurs are increasing in number, and this is a way to climb the social ladder, I think. And then there's another example. In Italy, industrial clusters. And I don't know whether Professor KRANTON's model can be implemented in the context of industrial clusters. Well, this was a sort of very long question, but it's a kind of stimulus to the audience so that we can have a brainstorming together how this model can be applied in Italy in different fields. Maybe I could give the floor back to Professor KRANTON. I mean, I have been a bit aggressive in this long question, but maybe you can react now and after the questions asked by the audience.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think that the job here would be for those who have done some deep observation of the Italian context. So one of the most important things of this kind of study is to understand the social context and understand the social setting well. So the first place I would turn would be to people who have studied the social context within Italy. And to pick out just one of your points would be, for example, what does it mean, what is the meaning of work? Right? So I'm going to your factory workers versus your, your small family companies versus your large trained unionized companies. Here it seems the notion of how people understand what work is, and how is work part of themselves, or is it something that you do for you? Is it something that you do for your family? Is it something you do for your company? There can be different social understandings of work and participation in different institutions. And so I would say that, again, we're going to look for our three ingredients, and the three ingredients would need to come from a good study of the Italian context. And I can imagine that we're going to come up with quite different answers to these questions. So the question of what is work, and what does it mean to a person to work? In, say, the Italian context, or the German context, or the American context. So that would be my short answer to a long question.
I wasn't thinking about it until you brought it up, but a study of that would be Banfield, the moral basis of a backward society. So that would be exactly a study, and it would talk about the differences between how people look at work in one society, in Italian society, relative probably between the North and the South. So just to bolster exactly what you said.
Can I ask a question? Shall I speak in English or...
Why don't you speak in Italian? I'll put these on.
In Italian?
Yeah.
Let me do it in English because...
Whatever you like.
So
I can understand.
The thing. I mean, the way I understand your definition of identity, which, your presentation was extremely interesting, and, I think I share many of the things that you were saying. The way I understand the identity is essentially as the borders within which a number of norms are collectively shared. And so identity is needed in order to ensure that these norms become a culture. And so identity grants enforcement to the norm because it defines a collectivity. So essentially, you need at least two people that identify with something. Otherwise, there is no scope. My question is, how does identity arises, and why, if it is so advantageous, for instance, in organizations, you see that sometimes, people tend to identify the organization. In other organizations, the thing fails completely. Here, from the point of view of the organization, let's say a number of corporations, there are strong incentives to have workers that are identified with the firm, precisely because, that is a cheap way of getting and extracting effort. But I think that is also something that workers understand. They can be exploited. And so the definition of identity, I think, is tricky, because you need some mechanism that ensures that once you are identified, you are not exploited.
I think that indeed these types of mechanisms that we're talking about, where people may be induced to think about themselves in particular ways and then are exploited, it actually happens. So there's nothing to say that these identity processes that we're describing are good or they're helpful for people. Indeed, people do internalize norms that put them in a subservient or exploited position. Okay, so I don't mean to say that creating worker identification is always going to, lead to some nirvana where people are working for the good of the firm and they're getting paid well. And in fact, I just only touched on it here, but this is one of the points that I touched on it, but it deserves much more attention, especially given your question, that there are structures within the society. So it could be, people who are interested in having a docile workforce that may indeed profit from particular kinds of social norms and social arrangements. So I don't think there is such a guarantee. But what I think, if we want to think about this in a larger sort of setting, I think there should be people, if we are interested in social justice, then there are people who should go to these exploited workers and say, hey, you should start thinking about this differently. And of course, in fact, we do, that is a process we have seen occur. That's exactly what happened in the early part of the 20th century. So there is a bit of, these things turn around, and there are people who have particular visions, and not only for profit and not only for advantage, but who are concerned with social justice, who would like to change these situations as well.
Sì, buonasera, Alberto Iezzoni, Bari.
Just a second. Okay.
Buonasera, Alberto.
Good afternoon, I come from Bari. And I have a question on the workers' identification with a company. In the 90s, in Italy, there was a new wave, the wave of the Japanese corporate philosophy. There was the first acquisitions by Japanese companies, and Kaizen was mentioned, the myth of Japanese workers loving or working for the company, and their children already knew at the age of 7 that they would have a place in the same company, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure you are much more aware than me about this process. What happened to the Japanese philosophy of workers' identification with the company? Because now nobody's talking about it anymore. And then in the internet there's a video on Mr. Silvano Agosti, and the title of this video is The Typical Enslaved Person's Discourse, illustrating the thinking of this person on work in general. But my question is about the Japanese philosophy about workers' identification with the company. Thank you.
So we went two at one time? No. Okay, can I go ahead? Should I go ahead and answer this one? So I cannot claim to be an expert on the rise and fall of the Japanese method, or especially in Italy. I can say that there has been a similar kind of talk in the United States, and there's certain, especially automobile companies, that have tried to introduce these kind of systems, and there's been some wonderful anthropological work on workers in these factories, and indeed you see that it's not so easy to transplant just this firm context from Japan to the United States, say, and expect it to work. And I'm sure that would happen in Italy as well, because it's supported by an entire structure, right, with notions of what it means to be as part of a family and loyalty and so on. And so what I do see, though, that's happened is that, one other point. So in some of these studies of these car factories in the United States, you actually do see that workers kind of get it. They get it that they're supposed to act in a certain way, but they don't really believe in it. And so they'll try and overact in order to achieve their goals. So this is not like a perfect indoctrination system. People will figure this out. But I do think that some of these, so the sort of stereotypical extreme version of this has not lasted, at least as I can see, in the United States. But you do see vestiges of this. So you do see vestiges of these kind of worker motivation techniques. So Walmart, for example, I don't know if you guys know Walmart. Is it here? Not yet? Okay. It's not going to ever come here. But anyway, so you know what Walmart are these huge, okay, you know what it is. Yeah, so Walmart, if you ever go to a Walmart at, 7 in the morning, as I did every now and then, to get my kids diapers. But anyway, you'll see the workers doing these cheers, W, A, L, M, and this is part of this, what you sort of think of the typical Japanese calisthenics in the morning, but associated with this big Walmart cheer. So some of this kind of ideas that you might associate it with more Japanese, of course this is an American thing too, to do the spelling out business, that's like what you do with football teams. But I don't think it's completely disappeared. I mean, some of these ideas have remained within at least the American context, not in the full force that they were introduced, but they're there.
Yeah, I would like to bring a parameter which you didn't mention in your presentation, in your lecture, a sort of Italian touch, I would say, which is family. Mm-hmm. Because I think family shapes identity very much. Mm-hmm. And it gives an initial capital, I would say, initial asset to give a future to the kids, of course. So it can be a place where identity and economics, at least individual economics, meet. So have you thought about it? And
well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we have thought about it to the extent that we've thought about the educational process, so that the choice of a school for your child is an extraordinarily important choice that at least parents in the United States make, because parents in the United States actually do have these choices, at least even though it may be a limited choice, because if you don't have the money to pay for a private school. But that's what this whole charter school movement is about, is that you may be able to create a school for your children in a particular way. But more broadly, I think actually there's this fantastic complementarity between this perspective, this identity perspective, and what Jim Heckman was talking about yesterday. So one of the things that you can deliver to your children is what he was calling these non-cognitive skills. He was talking about them as traits, but I don't think we disagree if we could say that some of this has to do with how I think about myself and what I'm supposed to do. Should I persevere? Should I finish something? Should I be working for a particular goal? So, I don't think there's a doubt that the family is important. It's what's teaching you, sort of your basic, your basic, again, I'm going to call them skills, but I don't mean it in terms of skills of reading and writing, but these basic capacities, say, for or abilities to achieve a particular goal and to think about yourself in a particular way. So those kids who are going to all of these different schools that I put up are going to have different notions of what they should be doing with their lives, right? And that's, again, coming from the parent-school combination.
Yeah, I really appreciate your presentation, because it makes it very clear what economists have to do if they want to adapt their models to include social norms. And I've been working on this with Dan Hammermesh and Philippe Vale on female and male total work in the average sense in economies. What we've observed, actually, is that over time, as countries get richer, the total amount of time that men and women work on average is converging. So the steady state is sort of Scandinavia and the United States and Britain are a little bit behind, and then there's Central Europe, and then you have Italy, and then you have the developing world at the very bottom. Men work a lot less than women. Okay? So the question is, for me, I love the idea of putting a social norm into my model, but you have to endogenize it, and then you get the criticism from our colleagues, you have too many degrees of freedom. The dynamics are completely undetermined. It's just ad hocery. So what's your answer to that?
Right. Well, sure, we've gotten those criticisms many, many times. Again, one is, I think it's important to have some discipline in in the research, and that's where I keep emphasizing these 3 ingredients and observation. So again, this isn't coming from my imagination, right? This is coming from the ingredients that I'm putting into these models are coming from deep observation of a particular social setting. So that is one part of the discipline that's placed on this. Now, it is true that once you kind of introduce some of these norms, or my 3 ingredients, that the distance between my assumptions and my results is extremely short. I mean, it's nothing, right? Fine, I'm okay with that, because maybe the assumptions are right, and this is the way we should be looking at things. A deeper question is, where is this all coming from? How is this evolving, and how is it changing? And this is a very deep question, and it's a question that we've touched on just a bit, because we've looked at, in particular settings, that someone may profit from changing the norms. Okay, so I touched on that in the smoking example. In the education example, the schools, a school administrator who may have a goal for educating students may have an incentive to change the school curriculum or the school culture, right, in order to have the students achieve. Okay, so in these particular micro settings, we're seeing some of these things. But of course, the larger study is still yet to be done. And, opening this up to, people in the room and to across the academy to work on these issues. This work needs to be done.
Possiamo, se non ci sono altre domande, proverei con un'ultima domanda a portare questa questione di identità anche.
Hold on, I'm only getting Italian here, so I'm on 6, but nobody's translating.
I'll try. C'è la traduzione ancora? Sì.
Yes, can you hear me now? Okay, good, sorry. If there are no other questions, I would like to go back to the Italian local identity. You know, that in Italy there are many different places which are very proud. There's a lot of local pride because of the city, of the province, of the region. Do you think this can be an element in the development of a given region? In the States, for instance, if in another region higher wages are paid, you tend to move there. Well, in Italy, you tend to remain where you were born, for instance, and you tend to try and make a contribution to the local development. So what do you think? Can this be an advantage or a limitation when people are not ready to move, so when mobility is reduced? You know, in Italy, there are many industrial clusters which have this pride, and they also operate as a sort of network, as a club. And maybe students in economics in Italy could try and adapt your model to this kind of reality.
Yes, certainly. I think that, again, it's kind of the double-edged sword here, so that segregation can lead to inequalities, but segregation can also have these, or segregation or grouping together can also have these advantages. So certainly a sense of pride and community can lead to lots of investment within that community. So again, I'm going to point back to research from the United States. This isn't where in ethnically diverse communities you may see less investment in what's called public goods and schooling and so forth. So in more homogeneous society, in more homogeneous communities, you might see more investment in schools and roads and other things which can advance development. And so certainly there can be these, I'd say, advantages for thinking about yourself as part of a larger entity that's all working together for a particular goal. Now, there are, of course, downsides to that too, because there may be people who are not who live within these regions, who may be wanting to emigrate to these regions, which could lead to, and who are not included in this majority group who are left out. So it's kind of a balance between this working for this larger goal, but at the same time being inclusive. So again, so it's just back to this sort of double-edged sword. But onto your clusters, because you mentioned this in your first question. These industrial clusters are quite remarkable, and certainly one of the aspects of identity and feeling part of a group is that you have some notion that you can either trust people who are like you, or you're more comfortable with people who are like you, which certainly can lead to enhanced exchange. So that is one of the things I think we could use this model to understand these industrial clusters.
Grazie.
Approfitterei del brainstorm.
Thank you. Maybe we could go on with this brainstorming. Last question. Last question. Otherwise I can give up, if there's no time. I think that maybe we should close this session. But then this discussion can go on, because we'll be talking about clusters, and maybe you can come and ask your question there, because you already asked one, that's why. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much, Professor Cranton.